How many people have I met that say, well, don't say the Arab Spring, it was the Arab winter. It was, even the name itself bothers a lot of people because you see, I often ask those who argue this, I say to them, give me if I was suppose a hypothetical that in 5 years' time, by 2025, that this wave, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth wave, whatever, of the Arab Spring, managed to create a new reality, a reality where people are free, are dignified, are equal, where they have their rights. Would we then look back at 2010, 2011 as being worth it or not? Would we have seen that price paid, the horrendous time between 2010 and 2020, as being worth then our children and their children living as free and equal human beings? I think that most people, most sane people and fair-minded people would say yes.
Assalamu alaikum legends, we got a great podcast for you today, but just before we begin, quick reminder to hit the bell button and you subscribe, get the notifications straight to your inbox inshallah. Again, as I'm mentioning, we always look at the subscription kind of stats and we see that many people haven't subscribed. There's still what, so please help this content get in front of more eyeballs and hit that subscribe button. Let's try and get 500 subscribers from this video inshallah. It's been working well, alhamdulillah. Let us know if you've done that in the comments below. Finally, please consider subscribing and donating to Islam 20C, £5 a month to keep it going. Let's kind of get 250 people giving £5 a month. It's only 16p a day. So number 1, subscribe and hit the bell button. Number 2, hit like and give us a comment. Number 3, click to donate. And number 4, stay awesome. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's Unscripted podcast. It's been 10 years subhanAllah since the Arab Spring. Was it worth it? We've got 2 excellent guests today. We have Jalal Ouerghi, a political activist and writer who's one of the leaders in the Ennahda Party in Tunisia, mashallah. And we have CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation, Dr. Anas Altikriti. Assalamu alaikum, gentlemen.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Salman.
I hope you're all jazakumullah khairan for joining us. This week is 10 years since the toppling of Ben Ali of Tunisia, and obviously we all know that it led to a cascade of Arab dictators and regimes falling like dominoes, and the revolutionary spirit that was termed the Arab Spring. So just for the benefit of the people at home, maybe they were young, 'cause it's been 10 years already, what would you say is the significance of this period known as the Arab Spring?
If I'm allowed to start, I think that the very first point that needs to be highlighted when talking about the Arab Spring is the context within which it emerged. The geographical context, the historical context, all these, they actually culminate in telling what an extraordinary event it was. For the very first time in several generations' lifetimes, there's a mass movement that occurs against regimes which had been around for decades and were, to be honest, seen to be going to be around for decades more. Yet, by a mere peaceful mass movement, not a military coup or an overthrow or an intervention from any Western power or military outside military source, by merely demonstrating on the streets en masse and staying on the streets fighting or resisting the regime's guns and firepower and attempts to force people to go back home with basically peaceful chants. Those regimes happened to crumble in a matter of days, literally, which was extraordinary, which was absolutely outstanding, something that no one, let alone the regimes themselves or even their allies in the West, expected to happen. So I would suggest that probably it was the context from which these en masse demonstrations emerged, the peaceful nature, and the fact that these peaceful protests managed to bring down regimes that had been propped up for decades not just the people at the top, but their entire families, the entire structure of those states. So that I think made it quite the exceptional event.
I can add to what Anas has said, that maybe the main significance of what happened in 2010, 2011 is a historical moment in the age of the Arab regime, Arab region, and the Arab actually civilization and history. After decades and decades of oppressive regime, dictatorship, corrupted regime, failing and total failure regimes that the region suffered from. The 2010-2011 moments was a historical real change for the face of that region, starting by Tunisia. And it was not accidental, actually, that this was happening first in Tunisia, as its civil society were in that time maybe the strongest in the region. And as well, it was not accidental that what happened in Tunisia sparked everywhere and spread everywhere in the Arab countries, because we always looked at that region as one place that what happened in any single country can affect and has impact on every another single country in that region.
Are you saying that just because you're Tunisian?
No, it's not about Tunisia. Yeah. And when I'm saying this, I mean that even if it happened in Egypt or in Iraq or in Syria, it will affect Tunisia. So it's a unity that will be affected with whatever happened in any single country. And that's what exactly happened in the Arab region in 2011, 2010, 2011. And I think it will be continue in the future. I myself wrote an article that will be published tomorrow, speaking about the third wave of Arab Spring. We already seen two waves. One started in Tunisia in 2010, 2011, and the second started in Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, and Lebanon in 2018 till now, and it's still going on. And I think 2021 will resume with, I think, more even we can say aggressive wave of a new Arab Spring.
But by the way, I mean, your question, Salman, isn't out of place. And I think that if I was in Jalal's place, I would be extremely proud that my country, my homeland, was where this all started. I think that's you know, the historic nature of this advent is something that needs to be really analyzed and dissected. For instance, one of the questions that I was often asked back then, you know, between 2011 and 2013, when the real impact of the Arab Spring took foot, I was often asked about why Tunisia? Why did the Arab Spring happen? For what reason? Was it because of people were in poverty? Was it because they were hungry? I mean, what was it exactly? And the actual fact, if you trace it back, the roots of the Arab Spring started when an unknown, totally anonymous fruit vendor in Tunis, when he was trying to sell, you know, his stock of the day, just to basically buy himself and his mother some bread and something to eat that day. And the policewoman came to him and ordered him away from the place he was. When he objected, she slapped him. It wasn't that he was he was doing a trade. He was selling what he had. He was, in a way, he was okay with living as a poor man. But what he didn't tolerate was being slapped. And that incident is a metaphor to the relations between the Arab regimes and the Arab people of that time. And therefore, that Mohammed al-Bouazizi found no way to express his anger, his rage, his frustration, his opposition, but to set himself alight. And that began the wave of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, after which, and due to the conditions that Jalal mentioned, because of the sort of shared commonality of culture, of language, of background, of oppression, all of these, it was like a domino effect. Immediately after, in fact, before the Tunisian revolution actually came to fruition, Egypt had already kicked off. And then Syria, and then Yemen, and then Libya, and so on and so forth. So it was like a domino effect. And that was why the forces opposed to the Arab Spring was so oppressive, was so barbaric in trying to bring this to an end, because it was just a matter of time when this wave of change was going to reach every single shore.
You mentioned something, Dr. Anas, that they cause the regimes to crumble, but someone might ask, what is it about a peaceful protest that can overthrow a regime? How does that? What's the mechanics behind that?
I think this is something quite fascinating. The fact is, and I'm a firm believer that peaceful protests are one of the most potent weapons that nations have, and that, to be honest, don't have a counter. You can't contend with hundreds of thousands of civilians just basically marching down the main street. You can't do anything about it. You can probably kill a few dozen, maybe even a few hundred, maybe if you're a totally barbaric regime, maybe even a few thousand, but then what?
And Anas, I can add, if you let me.
If I can just finish this point, if I may. The fact is that these regimes would love for the people to actually carry arms. They would love for them to carry arms. You know why? Because then it would become a symmetrical confrontation. And with that, obviously, the one with the bigger gun or the more guns would be victorious. However, being peaceful and unarmed with whatever army you have is an asymmetrical confrontation. And armies are simply not trained to fight people who don't fight back, who don't fire back. They don't have that kind of ability. And ultimately speaking, most Arab armies, regardless of the commanders, but most Arab armies are consisting of, people who come from families, local families and local, tribes and the such. And
that's where you get people who start defecting then.
Yeah, you
refusing
can't ask
to
people
follow
to kill
orders.
Their own cousins and their own relatives and neighbors.
Yes, and we must remember for a moment that for decades and for years and decades that these oppressive regime over the Arab world portrayed every opponent, every dissident as a terrorist, and they claiming to the international power that they are facing and they are in a war against terrorism and against terrorists, and portrayed every opponent and every opposition as its terrorism, and they are extremists, and they must be helped actually by the international power to try to control these opposition and these opponents. But suddenly in 2010, 2011, people disarmed this regime of this allegation that the oppositions and the opponents are extremists, and they took to the street unarmed with the protesting, and they just have their voices to raise against this oppressive regime. And that's a historic moment, as Anas said, and it's really maybe something that needs to be stopped at and studied very well, because it's changed the face of that region forever, I think.
You mentioned that Tunisia had a strong civil society, and that was something that contributed to, the melting pot that led to the conditions, that precipitated this revolution. Would you say that is something that differentiates some of those countries that didn't have any or much of an uprising, say like the Arab Gulf regimes, Saudi Arabia, for example? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think it's true. And if you even compare Tunisia, and you can say as well Egypt, in some points, that they've got a minimum of civil society, that they are free to move and free and resist even the oppressive regime for decades and for years. And that's helped them in Tunisia and Egypt to make their point first against this regime, because to be honest with you, you cannot see that a society without a minimum of civil society can face this bloody and oppressive regime. And in Tunisia, the solicitors, the union, the students, even the elite and the human rights activists are were trying for years and years, and many of them sentenced to prison. But whenever they found the opportunity, they took to the street and they protest, and they've been supported actually as well by international human rights organization, civil rights organization, and that helped them honestly to make their case stronger and stronger with years.
Dr. Anas, you mentioned this phrase, the forces that were against the Arab Spring. Who would you regard those as?
Well, essentially, the regimes of the region. I mean, imagine being at the head of a regime in one of the Gulf states, for instance, or one of the neighboring countries, and seeing what's happening next door, and seeing what's happening to the heads of those regimes who were sitting only a few days ago, who were sitting mighty and powerful and in total command, and then being totally toppled, often humiliated, such as in the case of Al-Qaddafi, for instance, or forced out before things turn ugly, such as in the case of Mubarak and bin Ali. You could imagine how they would do everything in their power in order to stem that kind of wave. So I would say that the first and foremost were the neighboring regimes, the regimes of the region, and particularly the Arabian Peninsula.
What about further afield?
Well, further afield, I'd say obviously the dominant Western powers felt like this was going to get out of control. When Tunis happened, it took everyone by surprise. Egypt was sudden, and no one expected things to unfold and unravel so quickly. So by then, I think that the Western powers had sort of made a decision that things would not be allowed to flow as they were, from one country to another, from one nation to another. Basically, nations were corresponding with each other, telling them, do this and don't do that. This is where you have to sit and protest and hold vigil. These are the kinds of placards that you need to hold up. This is what you need to be careful about when there is a power outage enforced by the regime, or when they cut off the internet, or when they do this or that, or when the media turns against you. This is what you need to do. So it was merely a matter of time before this wave reached the shores of virtually every single country, because the conditions were the same. Like I said, the story of Muhammad al-Bouazizi was a metaphor of nations that for decades long, probably an entire century, felt a deep sense of humiliation, of absolute marginalization, no sense of ownership of their own lands, no sense of control over their own destiny. So this was shared amongst every single Arab country, and it was just a matter of time before this wave reached everywhere. But imagine someone sitting at the head of the French state or the British state or the American state, and only a few weeks ago, I'd signed long-term contracts, whether it be about energy, whether it be about oil, whether it be about trade, or whatever it was, and all of a sudden, the very same person I had just signed this contract with, in hope that thousands upon probably tens of thousands of my workers would be working in factories and I would be getting millions and millions and millions of profits, all of a sudden that person is no longer there. So what's going to happen to the recently signed contract? What's going to happen to, unfortunately, the biggest problem of the Arab region, this region we call the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, the biggest problem, whilst yes, it is the regimes that sit upon the breaths of the Arab people, but actually, it's the Western and Eastern powerful powers that back them, that prop them, that give them the legitimacy that they don't have internally. So once the locals, the nations rise, the West was left in a very difficult decision. And ultimately speaking, they knew that they needed to intervene, at least so that the outcome isn't to their detriment.
How did they intervene?
The outcomes. Well, we saw how, for instance, the Americans intervened in Libya. We saw what happened in Syria, the total sullying of the Syrian revolution. And to be perfectly honest, the ultimate winner of that, although the international community for years, up until 2014, 2015, posed as though they are in support of the Syrian revolution, but it became extremely clear that it was hoped that Syria would become a proxy war for various agendas, whether it be Israeli agenda or the American agenda or the local agenda, Iranian or Russian agenda or the such. And therefore, the revolution itself, which I still call a revolution, but unfortunately it's now called a civil war or such, as though it's an equal or war of parity. It was sullied, it was ruined, and therefore anyone who hears about Syria right now just doesn't want any mention of it, regardless of the fact that the sacrifice offered by millions of Syrians, whether still in Syria or whether those who are forced out of Syria, is something that needs to be really revered in history books.
Is what you've heard so far interesting? Give the video a like and a comment to get more people to see it. Also, don't forget our target of 250 people giving £5 a month to help Islam Tunisia keep going. Speaking of history books, I mean, if somebody comes along in decades' time, or even today, and says, look, this Arab Spring, look at Syria, Libya, Yemen even, was it all worth it with all the blood spilt?
Yeah, I think it's worth it. And I think, as I said before, the Arab Spring never ended. And it will continue with its third wave, because what the region and the people suffered for decades from these oppressive regime and turned this country to be a wide prison that imprisoned all the people in there. It's something worth to get rid of, whatever the prices. And people paid a huge price for these moments to arrive, because what happened in 2010, 2011 is a point of culmination of struggle of people for decades and decades. People died in prisons, killed in street, and intimidated in every way. So it's worth to take to the street and to defend the rights and the human rights and the future of the new generation. And of course, we will something that maybe played the real obstacle in the face of the people who want to change and want to make their future better is, I think, the international order. International order is still not for the benefit and the interest of the people, but for the interest and the benefit of this regime. And that's why when the revolution took place in Egypt, especially because it's a key country, the US intervened directly and immediately without any hesitation. And the first year of the revolution, the US ambassador sat with the chief of staff of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, at that time, every week for 1 year to plan to overthrow Mohamed Morsi as even though it's a democratically elected president, but unfortunately the international power, they don't look at these change are for the benefit of the people and for the benefit of the stability of that region, but they saw it as the Islamists came to power, so they must be deposed and must be overthrown. And that's why when Mohamed Morsi has been elected, Barack Obama, which is from the Democratic Party in that time and the president of the US, said when Morsi declared as the winner of the presidency in Egypt that Egypt is no longer a close friend to US.
I think that the question that you asked, Salman, I've been asked, I don't know, dozens of times.
I'm playing bit devil's advocate, by the way. I know it's a flawed question,
but no,
just for anyone watching.
It's a question that goes through many people's minds, by the way. And myself and Jalal, we hear these questions, every single time we talk about the Arab Spring. In fact, how many people have I met that say, well, don't say the Arab Spring, it was the Arab winter. It was, even the name itself bothers a lot of people because you see, I often ask those who argue this, I say to them, give me if I was to pose a hypothetical that in 5 years' time, by 2025, that this wave, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth wave, whatever, of the Arab Spring, managed to create a new reality, a reality where people are free, are dignified, are equal, where they have their rights. Would we then look back at 2010, 2011 as being worth it or not? Would we have seen that price paid, the horrendous time between 2010 and 2020, as being worth then our children and their children living as free and equal human beings? I think that most people, most sane people and fair-minded people would say yes. Also, we need to pay attention to a historical fact. And since there is this theory that history goes round in circles, every now and then, when a certain nation or a certain people allow themselves to be subjugated, allow oppression to rule, or allow injustice to dominate, after so long, some generation will have to pay the price for this. This doesn't come, it's not just me staying quiet and letting my rights be violated every now and then by the ruler. It's not just that. It's the fact that my children will be paying the price, their children will be paying the price. In order to change, there needs to be a generation that sacrifices. And I personally see that within this historical reading of how world events turn, and this is not just for Muslims, it's not just for Arabs, this is how human nations evolve and move on. There is a generation that comes and needs to pay the price, the penance for the decades and generains of allowing oppression to rule.
And as well, we must take into consideration that when people took to the street in Tunisia and everywhere in the Arab world, no one told them to take to the street. They went to the street spontaneously, and they are ready to pay that price. Until now, I think, because that's why we said that it's a historical moment, because no movement, no political party planned for that moment to be taken place, but people took to the street spontaneously. They paid the price, and they are still, I think, ready to pay the price, because they already been killed, they already been oppressed for years and years and decades, so they have nothing to lose. I think that's why that moment took place.
Yes, well, I mean, our Sheikh Haytham, he used to point out that this question is not even a rational one. It's not like some people sat down and said, let's do this because we know what's exactly what's going to happen in the future. And you can't, even in a fiqh sense, you can't judge someone if they've been oppressed for so long and they've just reached a limit and they have to explode, But Ustad Jalal, you mentioned that thing about the US ambassador, someone's meeting Sisi on a regular basis. Is this something kind of documented that they had a hand in the overthrow of Morsi, or is this kind of like, are we looking at maybe people can say conspiracies and that kind of stuff?
It's documented and witnessed by lots of witnesses in that era who played the role, political roles, and even some close to Sisi himself, who is now the president of Egypt. They witnessed that Sisi was sitting for every month with the U.S. ambassador, planning for the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, and even another guy who is the ambassador in Libya as well. He said he wrote that in his biography, who said that we planned for the overthrow of Morsi, but we didn't plan for him to be in prison, but to be in house arrest, but they didn't play by what we have agreed. And Mohammed al-Barad'i as well, he said that. So it's a documented thing, and nothing now can put these facts into question anymore.
By the way, one of the most telling impacts of the Arab Spring, not on the region itself, but on the West, is something which is quite interesting, and I would urge people to pay attention to that. If you all recall, those of us, probably old enough, that excludes you, Salman, old enough to recall those days, you'll remember that in almost at the same time as the Egyptian revolution was taking place, as people were sitting in Tahrir Square, as the TV stations from around the world were converging on Tahrir Square and showing the signs of people of all ages, of all genders, of all backgrounds, of all religions coming together and sitting there in opposition of their government, immediately started a similar movement in several capitals in the West. And we had the Occupy movement. If you recall, that Occupy movement stayed for about 3 to 4 years thereafter. And I personally went to Washington, D.C. and passed by a particular square where the Occupy movement had sat, and there were placards saying, "This is our Tahrir Square." And our Hosni Mubarak are the banks who stole our money, for instance. And our tyrant is so and so and so. So everyone saw the importance, the symbolic importance of what was happening in the Arab Spring. And all of a sudden, the Arab world, which was seen then through the writings and observations of Orientalists across generations, seen as a very dark, regressive, backward, uncivilized sort of region and people who, as one person put it, produced nothing for the world apart from petrol and terrorism. Nothing else. That's all that came from that particular region. It's sort of a cursed, downtrodden, no good for nothing kind of region. All of a sudden, it became an inspiration to the world. These people whom we saw as regressive, backward, uncivilized, unread, all of a sudden showed that they expressed the pinnacle, an example of political opposition in a way that would actually topple regimes supported by the most powerful armies and the most powerful states in the entire world without shooting a single bullet. In fact, their bare chest receiving bullets from the state. But it was absolutely incredible. And the other thing is that I think one of the greatest gains that I, for instance, and this might sound a little bit selfish, but I, as a political analyst who lives in the UK, who has lived in the UK almost all my life, it gave me, it affirmed my conviction that when, unfortunately, my country and European countries in the United States, when they proclaim democracy, they only proclaim democracy for themselves. Indeed. We don't mean democracy for everyone. And certainly we don't mean democracy for that particular region where there are so many strategic and energy interests and ideological crossovers, that people feel threatened by. So the call for democracy, I would happily stand up now in any parliament, and I have, and declare our proclamation of democracy as being entirely hypocritical based on the track record that the entire world saw. That these so-called democracies allowed a fledgling democracy in Egypt to be crushed by a military coup and thousands of innocent protesters being slaughtered in one single day, yet do nothing whatsoever. Nothing whatsoever. That to me is a damnation of that proclamation of democracy.
Someone might say, like you mentioned, the whole Orientalist discourse about Arabs and Muslims and the Orient, that these people are kind of just disposed to despotism and being ruled by dictators and they can't do democracy. What do you say to that when you look at Syria, Libya, Egypt now, Yemen? Are these people right?
I think what happened there, honestly, as I mentioned, that what played against the will of people, even though they took to the street and they tried to defend their rights, what played against them is the will of the international power. The international power took the side of the oppressive regime, and they helped them. And even in some successful, partly successful cases like Egypt, the revolution succeeded. They held a democratic free election. A new president has been elected. But in that time, the Western, especially US, intervened and toppled and helped the toppling of that newly elected president. And the case of Egypt, you can widen it to the other country as well. Even in Tunisia, in the first few weeks of the protest against Ben Ali regime, France was sending arms to the Ben Ali regime to face the protest. Even they were peaceful, but they are trying to take the side of and support and back these oppressive regime. And I want to point actually what happened in US in the last few days. Support of Donald Trump, they took to the street and they swarmed the building of the Congress. Now Donald Trump has been against he's been actually impeached by the House of Representative, and he will be impeached by the Congress, and the whole elite of the US raised against these kind of movement. But when it comes to Egypt, as Anas said, a freely democratically elected president toppled from its post. Then people took the street peacefully. They've been murdered with hundreds and hundreds. But in that time, it's a Democratic Party who ruled the US, which is Barack Obama, and he didn't do anything. Even he didn't condemn what happened there. So actually, it's not about these people in the Arab country that they are with the culture of despots and dictatorship. When you saw what happened in Algeria for about 1.5 years of protesting every single Friday for about 80 or more weeks, with million took to the street every Friday, but no one has been killed for about 85 weeks. And that shows that people are civilian and they are ready to defend their rights without committing any crimes or violence. Maybe even in the Western, you cannot guarantee that millions took to the street for every week for even 1 month only, and they didn't vandalize and they don't commit violence and atrocity even against the police.
It happens every Friday and Saturday night anyway.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I agree with Jalal. I think that if anything, the Arab Spring came to disprove the whole image that was constructed of the Arab people. And if anything came out of this, then, yes, I mean, Jalal points to what's happened last week in Washington, what has been happening now for almost 2 years in France, the Yellow Vest demonstrations, what happened regarding the Brexit demonstrations here in the UK and the such. I mean, to be perfectly honest, one would see those demonstrations that occurred in Tunisia and in Egypt particularly, as well as in every other country in the Arab Spring touched. You'd actually reverse that image and say that actually it's the Arab people who were the ones who demonstrated peacefully, who were civil. I mean, for instance, an example that unfortunately today we have almost forgotten simply amid the tragedy of Yemen. I mean, Yemen, I know Yemen. I got married in Yemen. I used to visit Yemen once or twice every single year. I have very strong friendships and relationships in Yemen. Every single male from the age of 5 carries a dagger. I'm pretty sure that those of you who've seen Yemenis in traditional dress, every single Yemeni carries a dagger. Guns are abound. There's no limit to carrying guns. Yet when the Arab Spring came to Yemen, there would be a cordon that was imposed by the protesters and the organizers. And at that cordon, every single person who would enter would surrender their dagger or would surrender their arm. And anyone who knows anything about Yemen and Yemenis would know that this dagger represents one's honor. You do not give away your honor. You do not give your honor to anyone else, yet each and every person would abide by that to the T. And a society where everyone is armed, when no one was killed, it just goes to show that actually, I think that we need to really troll through the Orientalists' essays about the people of those regions and really do a long revisionist troll.
Yeah, indeed.
One thing which is common that amongst a lot of protesters was the age, the average age, you can say, of the and the methods of communication, Facebook, Twitter, social media, that kind of stuff. And many have said that demographic and those وسائل الاتصال. Yeah, the the whole
modes of communication
and phones and smartphones and that kind of stuff. They said that was key to this Arab Spring, the revolutions one after the other, and I couldn't help notice that some of the biggest centers of cyber security now happen to be places like the UAE and Gulf monarchies. Is there a connection there, or am I kind of reading too much into this?
Of course, I think the social media played a key role in helping the protest to be reached by millions and millions in the country and outside the country. If I speak about Tunisia, for example, we as Tunisian in that time played living outside as political refugees, played a key role in helping the protest inside, because no coverage in media coverage inside, so we helped by taking their clips and video and their demand to the international media, Al Jazeera, Al Hiwar, BBC, and even myself. I spoke a lot. Sometimes I involved in about 10 interviews every day for a few weeks without stopping, and explaining the case of these people who took to the street in Tunisia. And I think the social media, Facebook, Twitter, the media played a key role, honestly, in that. And that's why, as you mentioned, now some regime who are considered as anti-revolution player, like United Arab Emirates, try to silence these social media and these key fact in motivating people and help them making their voice heard.
It's quite fascinating. I agree. I mean, not only did the social media play a role, there was also, for those on the ground, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera played a pivotal role and in fact, I recall several regimes, several people who were opposed to the Arab Spring saying that it's all Al Jazeera's fault, because they were the ones who actually facilitated all the voices of the people on the ground and in the streets and such, and opened up new platforms in order to allow for the Egyptians to speak and the Tunisians to speak and such. It also signaled a huge monumental shift in terms of something that up until then was regarded as professional media standards. If you would go to the BBC, for instance, with an image or a clip, they would say, well, we can't use this because it's unverified. But what Al Jazeera did was actually say, you know what? Every single person carrying a mobile phone, carrying a camera, for us, we will regard them as being a correspondent. And their coverage and the images that they send us will be accredited as being worthy of being published. With that, everyone, including the BBC and CNN, said, well, we can't be out of this game. We can't lose out, because Al Jazeera is bringing images from inside, within these protests. And we're not being able to access those places. So they also let go of those, extremely lofty standards of media professionalism, as they called it, and allowed citizen journalism to be part of their coverage. And that's
a very charitable reading of the BBC's intentions.
What can I say? I'm trying to be good here. But yeah, I mean, it's, and that's why when people ask about the Arab Spring, unfortunately, because of people's tendencies to be moved by bad news and to respond to negative images more than they do to positives. But actually, if we took a fair look at that entire Advent, from the contextual point of view, to the Advent and why it happened, to what happened and occurred in order to topple the regimes, to the aftermath, I think that we would see that in our lifetimes, it is arguable that there has never been a more telling, more monumental, more reality-changing and shifting event than the Arab Spring.
Yeah, indeed.
Sorry to butt in again, just a reminder to hit the subscribe button and help Sam Tunisia keep going with the £5 a month donation. Oh no! I mean, I was gonna ask this question, but I didn't know how to say it without laughing and keep a straight face. But why are Western powers afraid of democracy so much? If they themselves purport to be democracies.
I think part of it is culture of Orientalism, I think, and the Western, I think, see especially the main forces who are active and represent actually the main Arab region, which is, for example, the Islamists. The Westerns still look at them as they are either extremists or against their interests. So they are not happy to see them in power. Either they see them a marginal in participating in power or out of the power totally. And that's what happened actually in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia now. They are saying that they are happy to see the Islamist part of this governments, but they are not ready at all. And I heard more than an ambassador in Tunisia who said that they are not ready to see the Islamists leading the country. And that's totally against the democracy, because either you accept that there is a free democratic election, whoever is being elected have the right to rule, or you are against democracy. They are not saying that, but they are trying to put pressure in the first place on Islamists not to participate fully in the election, or they put pressure on them not to lead the country by themselves, but sharing the power with others. And it's happening right now in Tunisia, Algeria, and many other, Morocco and many other countries. So to be honest with you, I can say that the international order, till now, it's not in favor of the real social and political power in our region to rule and to express the will of people.
Just adding to what Jalal said, I think that there is, regardless of the passage of time, but the West still sees the MENA region through colonial spectacles. And unfortunately, it reads the region through its set of interests and fails to understand the mood and the trend of people. And whether we like it or not, this is now, it's not even a secret anymore. It's not even unknown or unheard of. Every single time, and I say bar none, every single 100% of times, when any Arab country has a free and fair and transparent democratic elections, ultimately, invariably, they bring the Islamists to power. It happened in Gaza when they went to them. They made the horrendous mistake of allowing election to go through, and more than 60% of people voted for Hamas. against all the expectations in the polls of the West, who thought that Hamas would only garner something like 30 to 35% at most. And it's happened again during the Arab Spring at every juncture of every single elections. In Egypt, within the scope of, around 2 years where Egypt was free, those golden years of Egypt modern history, there were more than 8 elections that happened on various levels. Every single elections that took place that were free and fair, every single election brought Islamists to power. That is something that the West basically refused to acknowledge, simply because it can only see the MENA region through its collection of interests, rather than through the culture, the heritage, the mood, the mode of people. And this, by the way, it might sound odd, but it's not. It doesn't mean that 60% or 70% of the Arab streets are, let's say, pro-Muslim Brotherhood or pro-Islamism or the such. It's because they have been through so much corruption and so much oppression, and with all their differences with the Islamic movement, yet they acknowledge that the Islamic movement generally aren't corrupt and generally do not oppress others.
They fear some higher power.
Well, and this is something that needs to be acknowledged. And once we come to that, and it saddens me, because I know that the more I say this and stating this particular fact, that to me is quite evident through facts, not just by assumption or just some sort of hypothetical, unfortunately makes Western decision makers more stringent about not allowing that region full democracy.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the kind of colonial impulses, because one of the other alongside the impulse to dominate is the impulse to civilize and to fashion the inferior race, people, whatever, in the image of the master, the kind of the white supremacist standard of liberalism and secularism and Enlightenment ideals and so forth. Do you think this is something that is happening or is in danger of happening in places like Tunisia, for example, where, I mean, Tunisia is one of the probably the only example where after the Arab Spring so far, they've transitioned from one person being in charge to lots of people being in charge and having a multi-party system and so forth. That, I mean, I recall one of our editors was saying, has been following, Tunisian politics in particular for a while, and debates about things like polygamy and mirath and inheritance laws and so forth. Trying to change well-known Islamic norms and rulings and so forth from the Sharia into something that is a bit more palatable for the Western tastes and so forth, or rather setting as a standard for our values, our concretization of human rights and equality and justice and fairness and democracy, setting as a standard a Western or a Euro-American kind of horizon of we want to look like that. Is this something that is happening in Tunisia, or is there a possibility for genuine Sharia-based democratic multi-party politics?
To be honest with you, it's the foreign policy of the Western is controversial. For example, they are siding with Saudi Arabia, for example, cutting the hand of people and let's say practicing hudud without any reservation, and they are close friend to the Western without any problem. And the same time, when political parties or political forces, like even Ennahda Party in Tunisia is a moderate political party, they are trying to adopt modernization, democratization, respecting the main criteria of human rights and international law, but they are not allowed to be ruled in Tunisia, for example, by themselves, or to have the majority in Tunisia. So it's very controversial, and I think many key factors playing a role in this, not only interests of these Western country in terms of oil, gas, and the resources in that region, but also as well they are trying to have impact on the culture of these country. For example, Tunisia, now many European countries, even the European Union itself, they condition the support of Tunisia with, for example, adopting the equality of share in the mirath and other things. So, and as well acknowledge the right of homosexual people. So it's something that they are trying to use their support and their power to have influence on changing and modify the culture of these countries, especially when it comes to countries that they are weak and they have limited resources. They are trying to help them, but with a poisonous support, if we can say.
I think that Salman. I think that it's actually quite dangerous of us to assume that in very fragile situations. I mean, the only example that we have still standing is Tunisia. The only example that we still have from all of that, we still have is Tunisia, and we're praying every single day that it sustains. It stands. It continues to stand. I think Jalal, who knows about Tunisia far more than I, obviously, would agree with me that even those who are calling for the return and restoration of the Ben Ali regime are growing.
Yeah.
There are more calls and louder calls for bringing back the old regime. So in such a fragile situation, to then assume that an Islamic party, essentially, or a political party with an Islamic reference, can then push forward with legislating according to Sharia, I think is naive to say the very best. At this moment of time, what we want of every single Arab country, I think bar none, absolutely bar none, is states of justice. All we need now is justice. We need equality. We need humanity. We need dignity. We need human rights. Once those are established, and once they really, to take hold and become established and become unthreatened and become strong, then there could be an internal debate about the laws and regulations and legislations and Sharia or otherwise and the such. People can have a civil debate without fear, without being influenced by whether internal factors or outside factors. And then things will take shape. At this moment of time, to demand that, wallahi, I want in a country where there is absolutely no right whatsoever, that I want the implementation of Sharia, I think is folly. And it does Sharia an incredible disservice.
Couldn't someone argue that what you just described is Sharia?
I would say it is. I personally would say it is. But what I'm saying is, giving the examples that you mentioned, for instance, what Jalal stated, I think
in terms of putting the most important things first with a roadmap
the pillars of any society that can then adopt Sharia is that people are free, that people have human rights, that people are independent, that the state is independent from foreign forces as well as internal forces, to actually have this kind of debate and dialogue away from any kind of enforcement or compulsion.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Just quickly, I'll get your views on whether or not President Biden will make a difference with President Trump when it comes to the flourishing of freer societies, democracies in the Muslim world. Do you think it will make a difference or not?
To be honest with you, when the name of Biden and the Democratic Party mentioned in front of me, I straight away remember Barack Obama, the administration of Barack Obama. And that time, the Arab Spring took place. And we didn't see an encouraging attitude from the Barack Obama administration towards the will of people to change in the Arab world. Even though when he came to power in the first mandate, he said that we learned a lot from 9/11 and we are not supporting anymore the oppressive regime. But straight away after the will of people started to be represented in free democratic election in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt especially, Barack Obama himself, and I say it again, he said in the day of the election of Morsi as a president that Egypt is not a close friend to US anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that those relying on the United States and whoever is sitting in the Oval Office to radically change realities on the ground is just basically fantasizing about something which is not even worthy of being a fantasy. Very little will change. What will change is the language. And what will change, and by the way, this I don't shy away from saying, Trump, with his tremendous faults that belie anyone's ability to comprehend, actually brought us one good thing, and that is he spoke what he thought. He said what he thought, and that was something that was quite unique in the case of the United States. And I think that most people today want someone to actually stand up and say, you know what, I don't care about human rights. I care about our contracts and money. I think it's good for a president to say something like that. You know, when Jamal Khashoggi, for instance, was assassinated, and when Trump was arguing against those calls to sanction the Saudi Arabia, he put it very simply, very clearly, and very unequivocally. He said, listen, I'm not going to let go of $500 billion of contracts so that the Russians can get in. That would be silly and stupid. That is essentially what every single American president thinks. But no American president up until then had actually dared said it. So I'd rather than, talk to people about democracy and human rights, I'd rather someone, actually speak clearly. The other thing which I think is a good thing, I don't think that we should care much about who governs the United States. I think that we have realized through the Arab Spring that we can bring change by ourselves with our own means. And if we manage to get the world just to not interfere, things will radically change. It's the only, by the way, the West is what props up these regimes in the Arab world. That is alone, because none of them have the local legitimacy. None of them has been brought by a local election. None of them have a wave of public support. All they have is that they are supported by America or by Britain or by France or by whoever. That's the only thing that they stand by. So if they lose that support and people rise in order to gain self-determination, they have no chance whatsoever.
Yeah. I just want to ask you one final question because I'm wary of time and just kind of wrapping everything up. What do you think is the future now, not just for the Arab Spring, but the Islamic Spring, the Muslims across the world in the political realm, bettering their representation, bettering their societies, increasing justice, access to these basic dignities. What do you think that the next few years is going to bring?
Let me make two short points. The first is maybe we struggle in the Arab and the Islamic world, struggle for years, for decades, for real change, for a better society, justice, democracy, expressing the will of people. But we always facing these international power and the international order, which is in our favor at all. But let me say that in the last few years, we can see a shifting of power. And we are not now about US rule the police of the world, and they can rule and they do whatever they want. I think this is a point that we can exploit and profit from to push for real change and real improvement in our life. The second one is and this is I learned from the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic. I think in some moment in history, when the will of people face a real obstacle, thing that prevent any change, pandemic, natural causes, major natural causes can play a role in shaking this equation towards a new spectrum. And I can see that very well today. And what we are about to see with this pandemic is something very, very crucial to monitor, because it's very interesting, and it will have a great impact, not only on the Arab world, but in the world, and we can benefit actually from that.
Taking from that, I'm extremely optimistic, despite probably events, disproving me time and time again. But I'm extremely optimistic. I think that the emerging generation of young men and women is very in tune, very capable, has mastered the means of communicating with each other, of exchanging ideas. I believe that they've seen, I recall up until the Arab Spring, I recall teaching and being taught before that how seismic events in history would take place once every 30, 40 years probably. But since then, actually every year we have a seismic, probably life-changing event that's taking place. What's happening is, according to the famous saying, that there are centuries that go by and nothing happens, and then there are days that happen where centuries occur.
It's like waiting for a bus.
We are in the midst of this, and therefore this generation has seen so much on every single level, economic, political, strategic, on every single level. So, and I think that we are approaching a time when government's hold is waning, probably right now in favor for multinational companies and international, and the such. But still, it's a good shift and it's a good change. But before that, after that, during that, I take my lead from what Jalal has just said. We are in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And nothing can be, of a better scenario for us. This is ultimately, what gives us hope. You watch the news and you almost despair, but then you recall that everything is controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, the most compassionate. We're good. And inshallah, things will happen in our lifetimes. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I'm not talking about in 50, 100 years' time, in our lifetimes.
Inshallah.
Where inshallah, Salman will come back, have another podcast and talk about the great successes of
the third and fourth wave
of humanity. Inshallah.
Yes, indeed.
MashaAllah. Jazakumullah khairan, brothers. Ustad Jalal Ouerghi and Dr. Anas Altikriti, very grateful you guys could join us. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi.
And Jazakumullah khairan for you for watching at home. If you like this podcast, as usual, give a like and a share. Remember to click the subscribe button and hit the bell notification as well, so you're at the front of the queue for any new content that we upload. And don't forget, again, please, let's try and get as many people as possible to donate £5 a month to help keep Islam Tunisia growing. Inshallah, it's only 16p a day. The link's in the description. Until next time, I've been your host, Salman Bat. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Unscripted.